In the decade following the Civil War, America entered a period of Reconstruction and later experienced an economic boom during what came to be known as the Gilded Age. A national transformation was reshaping an agricultural landscape into an industrial and urbanized society. Big business, big cities, and big changes created a new horizon. Manufacturing and factories grew at a rapid pace. Urban centers exploded, and cities and towns drew hundreds of thousands of workers and immigrants from all over the country and the world. Business titans accumulated much of the country's wealth amassed on the backs of overworked and underpaid labor. Financial hardship forced families to send their children to work the streets, the shops, and the factory floors. By 1910, children made up over 18% of the total labor force.
Hard times are compelling people to seek out more stable pay, salaries, wages. But this also leads to a lot of child labor. There's children as young as 6 helping on the factory floor, people that are basically living in poverty. And so the more people from that household that they can get to contribute to that household makes them more financially stable. So really, it's their hard times financially that compels them to send their kids into the factories.
Low wages and poor working conditions created labor disputes and strikes. Unions organized to negotiate on behalf of the workers, and child labor laws eventually moved our nation's children from the workforce back to the schoolroom. Women and Black Americans strove to achieve their own rights. Women's suffrage became a large part of the American dialogue, and a new South was struggling to emerge. While Americans new and old were fighting for their own voices to be heard, the country as a whole had to redirect its focus on issues beyond its shores and the first global fight for democracy.
World War I begins in 1914. America is very loath to get involved, has been in Europe, European wars, ever since its beginning.
President Wilson is really determined to keep the United States out of it. There is a feeling of isolationism that entering this war won't serve the purposes of the United States. And so we try to remain neutral. We continue to do commercial business with the countries that are involved in the war, but as far as militarily, we really try to stay isolated from it.
You do have individual volunteers who volunteer to go fight either with the Canadians or the French. Individual Americans who make that choice.
Even before the United States' formal war declaration, we have a number of North Carolina citizens who determined to go champion the cause of the Allies to save France, essentially, to secure democracy for France. So they're volunteering in units like the British Red Cross, the American Ambulance Field Service, and later a flying unit known as the Lafayette Escadrille. An all-American squadron of fighter pilots that serve under the French military. We have the Lusitania sinking in May 1915, which really starts to bring home the war to the American people because there were American passengers on the ship. But from the German perspective, the ship was also loaded down with war material for the Allies. So they really do see it as us contributing to the war effort, even though we're not sending men in uniform.
Still, by and large, America did not want to take the step of going across the Atlantic and going to war. That war was over there, it was somewhere else, and it did not affect us.
Really what pushed America towards World War I was the Zimmermann telegram, which was an interference by the German ambassador in the Western Hemisphere. So violating that age-old Monroe Doctrine that Europeans are not to interfere in the matters of America's Western Hemisphere.
Their German foreign minister sends a coded telegram to the Mexican ambassador proposing that Mexico fight a war on the southern border against America and that Germany would help. Germany would send them aid and assistance and possibly even military help to help reclaim its territory lost in Texas, Arizona and New Mexico, thinking that this would keep America occupied on the southern border. Well, the British intercepted that telegram. Germany saw the manpower that America could potentially produce and send over to France, and did not want any part of that. So Germany's whole motivation in the Zimmermann telegram was to offset this news that they were resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, because they knew that would have a big backlash in America. And to keep America from entering the war, they said, let's send this telegram down to Mexico and get Mexico to keep them occupied. Ironically, Germany did not plan on that getting intercepted, and that telegram itself being the cause of America entering the war. And President Wilson announced it to the United States, and in his famous address to Congress said the world must be made safe for democracy, and asked for a resolution of war. Our sensibilities changed a lot after that. Public opinion was very much in favor of intervention after that.
Wilson really saw, he had been thinking about this for some time, that America's form of government, its democracy, was something that the rest of the world would benefit from in terms of a way to rule. He saw the conflict in Europe as being the leftovers of the monarchies that were still waging influence and empires within Europe, and that America's form of government could bring peace to Europe and a much larger part of the world. So he saw that America's influence could grow in a positive way by participating in the war and help shape the peace that would come after the war. And only by participating in the war, that was the only way that America was going to have a say in how the peace was going to be reshaped in the world. There's already a threat from Mexico because of the chaos that's going on down there. Pancho Villa and an internal strife that he's creating within Mexico. He has crossed the border in 1916 and does a raid near El Paso, Texas, within the borders of the United States. So to counter this, Woodrow Wilson mobilizes a lot of the National Guard, state guard units for federal duty on the Texas border with Mexico to allow a punitive expedition of regular U.S. Army troops under John Pershing, with Patton and a lot of other future World War II commanders on this trip as young lieutenants, while the guard units maintain the security at the border. When they return, the country is now in the throes of getting ready for World War I. Even though the recruiting efforts are going on and units in North Carolina are pretty good strength, the Army changes its what we call tables of organization for Army divisions, which means they need more troops. So what they're going to do is take the new draftees and place them in these guard units. And so the 30th Infantry Division is born. So something happens in 1917 in Russia. The Tsar is deposed by Vladimir Lenin and a Bolshevik revolution, and they quickly make a separate peace. And so the Russians are now out of the war. The Germans are able to shift all those divisions from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, and they begin to apply a lot of pressure to the Western Allies. So then that puts pressure on the Americans to get into the fight as quickly as possible. And of course, the American spirit is we're going to come in here, we're going to change this war, we're going to fight a war maneuver, and we're not going to get stuck in these trenches like all these other guys.
Most of these men were citizen soldiers. These were high school students. You have men who were just 20, 21-year-old college students that sign up to serve. They go to a 90-day training camp, and in 3 months of training, they're expected to lead a platoon of 55 to 60 men that they don't know in a foreign land where they've never been to fight Germany. So it was a shock to every single one of these guys.
And they quickly get indoctrinated to the fact of how the weapon systems, the technology has changed the face of warfare.
We were way behind on most technology. In fact, the only thing that we were able to equip our troops with were their rifles, the Springfield 30s, and the Colt 45 handguns. Everything else, other than uniforms, was supplied by the British and the French.
The dominance of artillery has made it such that trench warfare is something completely different that none of these soldiers were ready for, not even the leaders.
The soldiers were shocked when they actually got to the war zone, when they got out of these training areas where they had these cleanly dug trenches that were pristine and all the extra dirt was removed and they weren't quite muddy yet. When they got to the war zone, it was a wake-up call. Sort of the excitement of going to war was instantly done away with, dissolved instantly.
Samuel Iredell Parker, Cy Parker, he was Sam Ervin's classmate at Carolina. They were both seniors. They were both 4 weeks from graduating. Just like Ervin, Cy Parker drops his books, his studies, and goes and volunteers. By happenstance, he and Ervin are both assigned as new lieutenants to lead platoons in the 1st Division. Cy Parker is wounded in the first battle at Cantigny. At Soissons, he spends many hours taking a German machine gun post. For his bravery there, he earned the Medal of Honor. And not only did he earn the Medal of Honor, he earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2 Silver Stars. He was twice combat wounded, and he ends up being one of America's most decorated soldiers of World War I. He was more decorated than Sergeant York, and he was from North Carolina, Monroe, Union County, North Carolina. Sam Ervin was twice wounded in combat. He earned Silver Star, the Distinguished Service Cross, and he goes on to not only be elected to our state legislature, our state Supreme Court, he becomes a U.S. Senator from North Carolina. He's reelected and, of course, becomes famous as chairman of the Watergate Committee. But never in any of his public service, never in any of his campaigns for public office did he mention his military service. Did he talk about being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star for valor, or having Purple Hearts for being wounded in combat. Sam Ervin and Cy Parker very much influenced each other. Not only were they classmates at Carolina, they were good friends, and it's likely that they influenced each other to volunteer. After the war, one of them remarked that the 2 of us had the force of 3 men when we were together.
Iredell County native Edgar Halliburton, by the time the United States enters the war, he's already in a military unit. He's among the first to go over because, again, they're very well trained at this point and know how to handle themselves. But because he's the first over, he's also among the first in battle. And when he's captured, it means he's among the first captured, possibly the first American captured. So there's a real morale problem in the camps, and so he sort of whips everybody back into shape. He takes it upon himself to get everybody back in their military bearing, to instill a sense of organization and order and a sense of control when they don't have any. And it gives a lot of people hope. It also helps them keep themselves a bit neater and cleaner. It helps give them purpose. So a lot of men really credited their survival of the camps to Halliburton's leadership. The Germans came to his prisoner of war camp one day and actually took his picture. They wanted to brag about the Americans that they had just caught. Look at these first American prisoners of war that we have now. They're taking propaganda shots and photographs which actually make their way back to the United States. And just his sort of discomfort and just disgruntledness with being captured, his stance and body language was really like, it was still very much full of pride and determination. It caught the eye of an artist who actually sculpted small statues out of him in that picture, which were then used in the Liberty Loan campaigns to compel folks to give more money. So he really, while he's over in this prisoner of war camp, he doesn't know it, but he's raising funds back home to support the war effort.
Liberty loan programs, victory gardens, and food conservation campaigns were a few of the ways Americans back home were encouraged to do their part to support the war effort. The Women's Land Army, farmerettes, and carpenterettes took up the chores and jobs left behind by the mobilization of military units. Plants and factories across the country retooled their manufacturing lines to provide war materials. In North Carolina, furniture makers refocused their talents to craft airplane propellers from wood harvested in the state. Textile mills, plants, and laundry services provided clothing to the soldiers.
The Red Cross plays a huge role in the United States, especially something called canteen service at local train depots. As troops are being mobilized to go to the front, they're sort of being filtered down these rail lines up to ports in the Northeast. So what these ladies are offering with this canteen service is sometimes a place that a guy can get a shower or read a book or get a meal.
The African American experience in World War I is consistent with that of the Civil War, that units like the Harlem Hellfighters want to establish the fact that they are just as capable, just as good as anybody else at serving and defending the ideals that are enshrined in our founding documents.
The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, they end up acquitting themselves very bravely, and France ends up awarding over 100 of its soldiers the Croix de Guerre, which was the highest award for bravery in France. They were recognized much greater by France than they were by their own country. And of course, Johnson posthumously earned the Medal of Honor.
There is a line of German defenses known as the Hindenburg Line that the Allies have been trying to break for years now, and they just can't get through it.
Hindenburg Line was supposedly impenetrable. They'd actually spent 3 years building up the defenses with concrete bunkers and command posts and lines of communications and fallback trenches and strong points.
Elements of the 30th Division move up and relieve the Australian troops that have been holding the position on this point of the line about late September 1918. And again, this line is thought to be impenetrable, but we're going to wage an assault on it anyway. We've got to break these German defenses if we want to have a hope of turning the tide of the war and ending this thing anytime soon.
And its first combat was to break the Hindenburg Line at the St. Quentin Canal, along with British units. And they did.
These North Carolinians break this line, previously thought to be impenetrable. They, win their ultimate objectives of nearby towns, but they do so at a very heavy cost. The 30th Division loses thousands of men, and these two regiments, the 119th and the 120th, account for about 75% of those casualties, wounded or killed.
It's impossible to describe monolithically the motivations of this very disparate group of young men and middle-aged men. What motivated them to go over there, what motivated them to keep fighting after they saw the horrors of war. Each man was on his own journey.
The commanders, the officials, the delegates decide that the war is going to end specifically at 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918. Men, part of the 321st, go into this assault not knowing that. They're on the battlefield that morning, slogging through sort of this nightmarish landscape, the broken trees, the mud, the barbed wire, under machine gun fire, under artillery barrages, scratching and clawing their way to the German lines. And exactly at 11 a.m., the firing stops, and it's quiet for the first time in years. And a lot of these North Carolinians don't know what to make of that. Again, for some, this is their first actual battle. This is their first taste of combat, their first sort of hour in this situation. And so they don't know what to do. A lot of them just stay pressed into the mud, their ear to the ground. They don't want to pop up. They're wondering if maybe this is some sort of German trick that they're going to start firing again as soon as we stand up. And soon down the line comes the news that the war's over. The armistice is in effect now. And so you have these two sides that were enemies just a moment before sort of rushing to meet each other. And the Germans are especially enthusiastic. They've been doing this since August 1914, and they're just as war-weary as anybody else. So they graciously greet the Americans, and they're handing out, candy and cigarettes and coins and, trading stories and shaking hands and just sort of celebrating the end of the war. It was quite a shocking scene to the Americans, especially the ones who, again, this was their first battle, and to have it end that way with this celebration with the enemy that was just shooting at you, which just killed your best friend. It was quite a scene.
Woodrow Wilson is an idealist, a Wilsonian form of diplomacy when we talk about that, but idealism, liberalism in a foreign policy, that nation states have the right to self-determination. He visualized the League of Nations. That is his idea. So the forerunner of the United Nations, he had this vision that out of World War I and the terror of that they could establish a League of Nations where nation states could bring their disputes, solve them in a deliberative legislative body, and that there would be no more need for world wars. That the reason that Americans were going to war is to make the world safe for democracy. And that really summed up Wilson's view that he wanted to try to export American democracy outside of the United States into the world. And he thought it was a very idealistic notion that he thought if he could do that, that we could move towards world peace and a better understanding of living together.
America going to France in 1917 and 18 was a fight for the security of democracy in Europe. And we returned over 20 years later to fight again for the security of democracy in Europe. We have troops that are assigned to NATO, to the UN, and bases that are still there under the mission of securing democracy in Europe. So that mission began long ago and has not changed in Europe.